And thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants will be on listen only until the question and answer session of today's conference, at which time you may press star 1 to ask a question. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. I'd now like to turn the meeting over to your host, Mr. Steve Cole. Sir, you may begin.
Okay, thank you, and welcome to today's NASA Media Teleconference on Carbon and Climate. This is Steve Cole at NASA's Office of Communications in Washington. We have a panel of NASA and university scientists here today to discuss new insights and agency research initiatives into key carbon and climate change questions. NASA is ramping up its efforts to understand how Earth's oceans, forests, and land ecosystems absorb, on average, nearly half of emitted carbon dioxide today. We have 5 speakers for you today. Our first speaker will be Michael Freilich, Director of NASA's Earth Science Division at NASA's headquarters in Washington. Mike Behrenfeld, who is actually joining us from the North Atlantic, who is principal investigator on one of our field campaigns going on right now in the North Atlantic, and from Oregon State University in Corvallis. George Hurt, lead for NASA's Carbon Monitoring System from the University of Maryland in College Park. Anne Marie Eldering, Deputy Project Scientist for NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatory-2 mission at the agency's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. And finally, Leslie Ott, Research Scientist in the Global Modeling and Assimilation Office at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland. Our panelists will give you their remarks for about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll open it to questions. If you're listening online and would like to ask a question, you can do so via Twitter by using the hashtag AskNASA. We'll get to those questions about halfway through our hour briefing. And if you'd like to see more information about this topic, we have quite a bit of information online already, and you can view that at www.nasa.gov/carbon climate. Okay, and we'll begin with our first speaker, Mike Freilich.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to all for joining. Carbon is an essential element for life on Earth. In the atmosphere, carbon plays important roles in the Earth's radiation balance and climate, since methane and carbon dioxide are potent greenhouse gases. In a few weeks, senior representatives of nations around the world will be meeting in Paris at the COP21 conference to discuss atmospheric carbon levels, their connections to the changing climate, and actions that humans can take, should we wish to influence future atmospheric carbon concentrations and the Earth's climate trajectory. Today, we're here to talk about NASA's work on a related question. How will potential changes to the natural world, namely the ocean and land ecosystems, also influence future atmospheric carbon concentrations? If we're going to improve our predictions of Earth's evolving climate, we need to improve our understanding of the answer of this question. Now, after years of development and testing, NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatory-2 mission is making first-ever global satellite measurements of atmospheric CO2 levels with the accuracies, precisions, and spatial resolutions needed to shed light on natural ocean atmosphere and land atmosphere carbon exchange processes. We in NASA have new satellite missions that are in development now and plans in the longer term to continue global spaceborne CO2 measurements into the future. In addition, NASA is now sponsoring and conducting focused oceanic, atmospheric, and land-based field campaigns to probe never-before-measured aspects of air-sea and land-air carbon exchange processes in climatically critical locations. These field campaigns are using advanced instruments mounted on ships, in research aircraft, and at land sites, and are bringing together the very best scientists and engineers in the nation and indeed the world. At the direction of Congress, NASA has also developed and initiated a carbon monitoring system, combining measurements and models to improve the accuracy of our estimates of land carbon on space scales that are important to human life and land use decision-making, scales of neighborhoods and fields and forest patches. Before my colleagues discuss information on recent results and plans, I'd like to briefly summarize for you high points of what we do know and what we don't know about the carbon cycle in the atmosphere today. We do know from ice core and other analyses that from the pre-industrial 1800s back for more than 400,000 years, natural processes somehow kept atmospheric CO2 levels between about 180 and 280 parts per million. And over a span of 10,000 years leading up to the Industrial Revolution, CO2 levels were nearly constant at about 270 parts per million. We know with certainty that globally averaged atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have increased substantially since the start of the Industrial Revolution, from about 280 parts per million in the late 1800s to more than 400 parts per million at present. And currently, the atmospheric CO2 concentration is increasing by, on average, about 2 parts per million each year. We do know with certainty that burning fossil fuel adds long sequestered carbon to the active land, ocean, atmosphere carbon cycle. We know that there are large year-to-year variations in how much fossil fuel carbon remains in the atmosphere. Generally, about half of the added carbon from fossil fuel burning stays in the air. But ground-based measurements suggest that some years, almost all of it stays in the atmosphere, and some years, almost none of the carbon from fossil fuel burning remains in the atmosphere. So those years, it must all be absorbed into the ocean and the land. We don't know key details about the individual natural processes that control carbon transfers to and from the atmosphere. These processes operate at very low levels when measured, say, on a square meter or a square kilometer, but they're tremendously important over areas of millions of square kilometers like the oceans and the boreal forests. We don't know how these land and ocean carbon exchange processes interact with and impact each other today. And we don't know how effective these processes and their interactions will be as ecosystems and their relationships change with changing climate. Some processes may end up removing more carbon from the atmosphere in a future climate, and some may become less effective than they are today. Our NASA satellite, field campaign, research, and modeling programs are focused on allowing us to understand better the roles of natural processes in determining atmospheric carbon levels, to understand better the connections between these natural processes, and to understand better how these processes may change positively and negatively as our planet's climate evolves. Gaining a greater understanding of our planet's carbon cycle is essential to furthering our knowledge of the Earth as an integrated system. Gaining this understanding is key to providing policymakers with objective facts and accurate predictions and their uncertainties so that informed decisions and policies can be made. And gaining this understanding is indeed a key objective of our NASA Earth Science program. So now I'd like to introduce Mike Behrenfeld of Oregon State University to discuss some ongoing carbon field campaigns from the North Atlantic. Mike, you're on.
Thank you, Dr. Freilich. Can you hear me all right?
Yes,
good.
Coming through great.
Oh, great. Okay, again, this is Michael Behrenfeld from Oregon State University. And I'm actually talking to you all from satellite phone from the research ship Atlantis. And we are in the middle of the North Atlantic subarctic region, just south of Greenland, and I'm here with 31 other scientists. And it's taken us 6 days of pounding through 10 to 20-foot sea to get here. And we're here to study ocean phytoplankton and also how plankton influence aerosols and clouds in the atmosphere. Just for a little background, figure 1 in your package is a picture of phytoplankton. These are diatoms that form a chain, and they are the microscopic plants of the ocean that form the base of the food web. Right now we're out here and the seas are pretty clear and pretty rough and cold, not very productive, but in a few months this very spot is going to be part of one of the largest plankton blooms on Earth that happens every single year. And what we're doing out here is we're trying to get out here in time to witness the very first stages of this big, what we call a phytoplankton bloom. So despite the fact that plankton are microscopic, they play a very critical role in Earth's carbon cycle. Michael Freilich alluded to this. About each year, about half of the carbon dioxide emitted from the atmosphere that does not remain in the atmosphere, this is on average, is taken up by the oceans. And the plankton, including the phytoplankton, play an important role in this ocean carbon cycle. And the first step in that role is the process of photosynthesis, which is what the phytoplankton do. The figure 1 shows some of those organisms. Over the annual cycle, so every year, if you look at the entire global oceans, this process of photosynthesis produces about half of the oxygen created on Earth each year. And at the same time, that process is producing oxygen and then taking carbon, equivalent to 50 petagrams of CO2, and converting that into organic matter, which is feeding our fisheries and removing carbon from the atmosphere. And a petagram is approximately 50 billion tons of carbon. One of the really amazing things that's happened over the last, say, 20 years is that NASA and other countries have launched satellite sensors that have allowed us to actually monitor the activity of these phytoplankton. And figure 2 in your package shows an example of this kind of satellite data. And what you're looking at here, this is just one example. This is the yearly average concentration of a photosynthetic pigment called chlorophyll. And by looking at this pigment over years and years, over 20 years, what we've learned is that when the ocean surface temperatures increase, we generally see that the concentration of these phytoplankton chlorophyll pigments decrease. And in regions where it cools, it increases. And from this information, we can estimate how ocean photosynthesis and thus carbon cycle things change as a function of temperature from year to year. And what's amazing is that from year to year, we can see changes in this photosynthetic carbon uptake on the order of 2 billion tons of carbon per year. What we really hope to learn from these kinds of analyses is how the oceans function today so that we can make some better predictions of how they might change in the future, how ocean ecosystems might be affected by as well as affect their carbon cycle in the future. So one of the things you'll notice if you look at that satellite figure, figure 2, is that the amount of chlorophyll is very different from place to place. And in particular, what you'll see, if you look at green and red colors, those are largely limited to coastal upwelling areas and high latitudes. I hope you can see that. And these are these areas of high concentration that we call blooms. And I put in figure 3 of your package a close-up satellite image of a bloom. And what you're looking at here is what's called a bloom of organisms called coccolithophorids. And they're kind of cool critters. They have these chalk-like scales on the outside of them. And that's what gives that picture you're looking at, kind of that milky white color. And these organisms are really important in the carbon cycle because they, these calcite or chalk plates, when they sink, they carry lots of carbon to the deep sea. So one of the very exciting things we've learned recently from satellites is that blooms like this and other types of blooms are behaving very differently than what we thought in the past and what you'll find in textbooks. It now actually appears that these blooms, hard to believe, actually start in the winter when the growth conditions are at their very worst. And this is one of the reasons I'm sitting out here in this boat in the North Atlantic trying to study blooms. We're trying to capture this very first stage of the bloom. If you'd like to learn more about this project we're doing right now, the project is called the North Atlantic Aerosol and Marine Ecosystems Study, or NAAMES, and it's part of the NASA Earth Venture suborbital mission, and Dr. Freilich had mentioned this as well. And the NAAMES study involves both ships and aircraft. So we have a C-130 Hercules flying over us, had that happen today, and we're studying not only blooms, but how the plankton produce organic compounds that get lifted into the atmosphere, become aerosols, and affect clouds. And you'll see in Figure 4 a banner of the NAAMES project, and at the bottom is a website that you can look at for more details. The last comment I wanted to make, and Mike Freilich also alluded to this, is that I think a lot of people in public think that NASA is all about satellites and space exploration. But in fact, there's also a lot of groundwork that has to be done, and NASA invests heavily in this so that we can understand what our satellites are telling us and also do the groundwork necessary to prepare for future satellite missions. With respect to the ocean carbon cycle, this next big step will be the PACE mission, and that will have unmatched capabilities of observing the ocean from space so we can dig much deeper into how these ocean ecosystems work. And with that, I'll stop and pass the discussion now to Dr. George Hurt.
Thank you very much, Mike. I hope everyone can hear me. I want to turn your attention to slide 5, or figure 5, and note that the land stores a large amount of carbon in vegetation and soils, together roughly 3 to 4 times the amount present in the atmosphere. In the context of the global carbon cycle, there are large exchanges of CO2 between the atmosphere and ocean, as Mike was commenting about, the atmosphere and land, and also large emissions due to human activity, as illustrated in this figure. Thankfully, as you've heard, only about half of human emissions on average remain in the atmosphere due to processes in the land and in the ocean sequestering carbon. We know the land currently absorbs about half of that, or a quarter of total human emissions. But there are large uncertainties in these estimates, and these uncertainties in turn affect our understanding of the major question, will this uptake continue? At NASA, we are innovating ways to measure and monitor carbon on land to better reduce these uncertainties, and conducting new studies focused on improving our understanding of changes in the most sensitive regions. I'd like to give just a couple of examples. If you turn to the next slide, figure 6, which is an animation, we can start by looking back to the 1980s, just roughly 30 years ago, where land carbon was mapped at very coarse spatial resolution, about 50 kilometers resolution, and in just 32 broad categories, as shown in this figure. In 2010, Congress directed NASA to develop the carbon monitoring system to increase the accuracy, precision, and resolution of carbon data to potentially support decision-making. And there are already many accomplishments. As you can see in the second frame of this animation, by 2011, NASA was able to produce a continuous map of carbon and vegetation for large areas of the world at 100-meter resolution, shown here for the U.S., with green areas indicating higher levels of storage and light areas indicating lower levels of storage. And just a year later, in the third frame of this animation, we illustrate that we produce maps for some large areas, including the state of Maryland, as shown here, at 30-meter resolution. At this resolution, more than 1 million times that available just 30 years ago, we are able to quantify land carbon now at the scale of land parcels, forest patches, neighborhoods, enough detail to fundamentally advance both science and the applicability of carbon data to support potential decision-making on land. Key to this technology, if you look at the next figure, figure 7, is LIDAR measurement. Now, LIDAR refers to light detection and ranging, and it's an active measurement made from planes or satellites that make a distance measurement to vegetation that is precise enough to effectively image the three-dimensional structure of vegetation from the top down. The images in this figure illustrate the kind of data that's possible. In the top left, you can see, looking down, on a patch of deciduous forest 3D structure vegetation. The colors indicate different heights of the vegetation, with red showing the tops of forest canopies and blue low-lying areas of the ground. You can clearly see the forest canopy, and in some areas you can see understory vegetation and make out even individual trees. In the bottom right, a similar image shows the kind of data that's possible of a coniferous forest, where individual trees are now clearly more apparent due to the spacing between them. Well, if you look at the next slide, figure 8, NASA is interested in scaling this technology up. And with more than 3 trillion trees on the planet, we're using a remote-based platform to do that. A new instrument named JEDI, which stands for the Global Ecosystem Dynamics Vegetation, is planned for the International Space Station in 2018. JEDI will provide the first comprehensive high-resolution data set of vegetation structure. These data will be critical to answering questions about the carbon balance of the Earth's forests now, as well as to inform new models that will address how the land surface could potentially help mitigate atmospheric CO2 in the future. These data are so useful, they will also help address critical related questions on the role of forests in habitat and biodiversity as well. In the next figure, figure 9, in addition to these innovative monitoring approaches, we're also focused on reducing uncertainties regarding potential changes in land carbon that may manifest in the future. In this regard, the Arctic boreal zone is an especially important region to consider, where climate change is occurring fastest and large quantities of carbon are presently locked in permafrost and are at the risk of being released to the atmosphere as they thaw in warmer conditions. In figure 9, you can see the phenomenon I'm describing. Focus on the left part of the figure, where you see that global warming potentially leads to faster organic matter decomposition, which in turn comes right back and increases CO2 further, leading to further warming. A new field campaign begun this year, the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, known as ABOVE, already has some dozens of projects and more than 100 investigators studying this region with new measurements and models, all part of an ambitious field campaign that will utilize NASA's unique capabilities over the coming decade. In closing, through new innovative approaches to carbon monitoring, like the Carbon Monitoring System and JEDI, and an ambitious new field campaign, like ABOVE, focused on an extremely sensitive region, NASA is taking major steps to improve our understanding and reduce uncertainties of the terrestrial carbon cycle, both now and for the future, in ways that promise to revolutionize both our scientific understanding and the information with which we can provide policymakers. Now I'd like to turn things over to Anne-Marie from the NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
Thanks, George. So each one of us has reminded you that we know on average 50% of the carbon dioxide that's released in the atmosphere each year from burning fossil fuels is removed by the Earth's ocean and land ecosystem, the plants and trees. But we still have questions. Where is that happening exactly? How is it changing from year to year, and what's driving that change? NASA's Orbiting Carbon Observatory-2, or OCO2, is gathering data that's required to answer these questions. OCO2 is focused on quantifying the sources and sinks of carbon dioxide, the regions where the carbon dioxide is released into Earth's atmosphere and where it's absorbed from the atmosphere back into the Earth system. We seek to do that on regions that are the size of large states and on monthly timescales. And we've just reached a really important milestone for OCO2. We now have our first full year of atmospheric carbon dioxide from the space-based mission. OCO2 gathers nearly 100,000 high-quality measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide each day across the globe. This is at least 100 times the amount of data that we had on a daily basis previously. And they're tricky measurements. We only just began this type of work because it took quite some time to develop an instrument that had the sensitivity we needed. The animation that you'll see in Figure 10 here illustrates some of the features of OCO2 data collection. So this animation puts dots on the map where we collect data. They're a little bit exaggerated so that you can see them with your eye. Each measurement from OCO2 is quite precise. We can see change of 0.25%, or 1 out of 400 part per million. And this graphic uses a color range that spans only 15 parts per million, or just 4% of the overall concentrations. This may seem like a small number of carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide is such a powerful heat-trapping gas, these changes are important. And in addition, when we want to learn about the sources and the sinks, we need to be able to see where the concentration has changed by just 1 or 2 parts per million. We aggregate data over 16 days to create the smooth map that you see here. That's the amount of time it takes for our spacecraft to get back to where it had started 16 days before. And our instrument requires sunlight to be reflected off of Earth for this measurement, so you'll see that the latitudes we measure at cover change a bit over the seasons. And if we move to the next figure, figure 11, this is just a still map of our carbon dioxide field in March. And March is the time of the year in the northern hemisphere that winter is fading away, but spring has not yet really arrived in full force. So the trees are not yet building up leaves. No carbon dioxide has been removed from the atmosphere by that process all winter, so you see these elevated concentrations in the northern hemisphere. In the next figure, figure 12, we're showing you the first half of June. And at this time, things have changed quite a bit. We have what we call the spring drawdown. So the leaves and the trees are starting to be active. Trees are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and building leaves. And we see changes of the order of 10 parts per million in carbon dioxide over the region of Eurasia because of this activity. So this spring drawdown is one of the big obvious features in our data set. And now that we have more than a year of data covering all seasons and a wide range of latitudes, we can really begin investigating a lot of science questions. Some other big features we've seen and are investigating are signals from biomass burning in Africa. This seasonal burning emits a large amount of carbon dioxide. We can see that in our measurement data set, and we're starting to quantify how much is released from the fires. We also see some tantalizing clues about enhancements over cities. Because the data is so precise, we can pick this out. Many of you are familiar with the way that the mountains of Los Angeles and the large population result in pollution being trapped over our city. The same principle holds with carbon dioxide. And with OCO2, we're taking a peek at how much extra carbon dioxide we see in LA relative to the oceans and deserts nearby. There's other questions we seek to study, such as how the drought in the western U.S. might be changing the carbon uptake this year. Or Alaska had a very warm summer, as well as some large fires this last year. Can we quantify how much that's changed the carbon uptake? And the current El Nino conditions and very warm ocean temperatures are likely to change the exchange of carbon dioxide between the ocean and the atmosphere. Can we say how much? To answer these and other science questions, we'll use global models, and Leslie will tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. In addition to measuring carbon dioxide, OCO2 sees some of the light that plants release when they're performing photosynthesis. We call this solar-induced fluorescence, or SIF. There's a host of observations and clues that show us that SIF is very closely related to the plant health and productivity. And to understand the role of plants in the carbon cycle, ultimately we want to use not just CO2, which is taken up and released by the plants, and SIF from OCO2, a measure of their activity, but other measurements from NASA missions, such as how much water is available for those plants, how much plant material is there, like what George showed us, and even what type of plants exist. The last figure, figure 13, is just a map of the SIF measurements that we've made recently. And again, these measurements integrated with other will help us study the role of plants in the carbon cycle. So we're very excited to have over a full year of atmospheric carbon dioxide and SIF measurements from OCO2, and the science community is now using this data to begin investigating questions about Earth's carbon cycle. Now I'll turn things over to Leslie Ott, my colleague from the Goddard Space Flight Center.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. So you've just heard a lot about the breadth of satellite and field observations that NASA makes to try to understand the carbon cycle. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're using models to pull all those observations together and to ultimately advance our understanding. But before I start and get into things, I want to just give a brief definition of what I mean when I say model. A model is really just a set of equations that describe physical processes in the Earth system. So our models now have gotten quite advanced. They allow us to simulate processes more realistically and to look at finer scales than we ever have before. But in essence, the concept of a model is pretty simple. It's just a mathematical description of physical processes as well as scientists currently understand them. So if you look at Figure 14, we have a movie of atmospheric CO2 that illustrates the complexity that we're capable of simulating with current models. This was produced using NASA's GEOS 5 model at a resolution about 1,000 times greater than previous generations of models, which is about the same spatial resolution used in today's best weather forecasting models. This movie shows us atmospheric CO2 during northern hemisphere spring into summer when the plants are drawing huge amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere, which is the same period that Anne-Marie just highlighted in the observations from OCO2. And the quantity that this movie is showing you is column averaged atmospheric CO2. So this is the same quantity that OCO2 is observing. And as we watch CO2 move through the atmosphere, you see some strong emissions from cities, places like LA. You also see the seasonal cycle of carbon that comes from the land biosphere and plants drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. But we see a strong signal of weather fronts moving carbon around, and you get a sense of all of the variability and complexity of the processes controlling atmospheric CO2. We have to try to understand all of these processes together in order to understand the atmospheric observations that we're getting from our satellites, which is quite a big task. So in addition to the atmosphere, we spend a lot of time and effort on models that describe the carbon cycle as a whole, including the land and ocean components. Models play a really, really important role here because the quantity that we really want to know about the carbon cycle, which is the total amount of carbon moving between the atmosphere, the land, and the oceans, as scientists we call this flux, this isn't observable directly, at least not at a global scale. So we have to rely on our models to ingest the observations and get the information out of them that we really, really need. If you move on to Figure 15, we'll see that our new measurements from OCO2 complement some of the observations that NASA has been making for a very long time. So, for instance, we've had observations of ocean color since about 1997, and those give us some important information about ocean productivity, although, as Mike mentioned, it's not the whole picture. We also have satellite observations of vegetation greenness, which kind of fill in the northern hemisphere, and those go all the way back to the 1970s, providing a lot of valuable information about how vegetation stores carbon and how that's changed over time. Some of those same satellites even provide information about fires and about the distribution of night lights, which give us information about where humans are emitting CO2. So we have some constraint on every aspect of the carbon cycle from NASA satellite measurements. Our models combine all of this with millions of observations of weather per day to give us a look at that carbon flux that we really want, and that's illustrated in Figure 16. And you can see that our models help us understand how this carbon flux is changing both over the course of a day and over longer time periods like seasons and years, and we need to understand all of that. Our models then transport these flux distributions in the atmosphere like you saw in the first movie, and now that we have OCO2, we can actually use those atmospheric observations to tell us how good our model-based source and sink estimates were to begin with. We know that they're not perfect, so the atmospheric data are a really important check that helps us figure out where the models are doing a good job and where we need to work more to improve them. So the motivation of all of this and tying this all together with models is to ultimately make models that are more reliable for predicting how the carbon cycle and climate are going to change over the coming years. So if you move on to slide 17, I'll show you one other thing about models that is really neat. They're helping us understand what we're seeing in the new OCO2 data. So this is a model simulation that's actually keeping track of CO2 emitted by fires and by big cities separately. If we just looked at the satellite data, we would see that CO2 was enhanced over a certain region, but we wouldn't know why or what were the processes controlling that. So by combining the satellite observations with more detailed model simulations, we can work to figure out what the signals that we're seeing in the atmosphere actually mean. In addition to OCO2, we're really excited to have a field campaign beginning this summer called Act America that uses aircraft to study the carbon cycle over North America in greater detail. And we're also working to design new satellites in the future that will help us see in the dark and actually fill in some of those OCO2 pictures at high latitudes where we weren't able to get observations. So all of this progress in remote sensing of atmospheric CO2 is really exciting because along with the land and the ocean observations that we've had for a longer time, we now have a much more complete picture of carbon in the Earth system than we've ever had before. For instance, we've never before viewed the spring drawdown of CO2 with the observations that actually show us how vegetation and atmospheric carbon interact. That's really exciting, and it's a really big innovation. And all of these observations are helping us to develop more reliable models so that we can move from doing just the science to actually supporting the work that's done by policymakers, as George mentioned. So with that, thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to pass it back to Steve for the Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Leslie, and thank you all of our panelists. Just as a reminder, if you're media on the call and you'd like to ask a question, it's *1 on your phone. And for the others listening, you can ask a question via social media on Twitter with the hashtag AskNASA. Okay, our first call comes from the phone lines, Peter King at CBS News.
Thank you, Steve. And anyone who knows me probably knows what kind of question I'm going to ask here, and here goes. You know, you've all told us about models, you've told us about the technology, you've told us about some of the findings and a lot of what you hope to learn. But in your best layman's terms, I need somebody to explain exactly what you think the main takeaway of what you found already should be from this.
Okay, we'll go to Mike Freilich on that question.
So thanks very much for the question. The main takeaway, there are a couple of points, I think. One of them is that the carbon cycle is quite complex. There are processes that are occurring on land. There are different processes that are occurring in the ocean. All of them are impacting how much of our fossil fuel CO2 remains in the atmosphere. All of them are impacting the future climate trajectory. The second takeaway is that we in NASA, with the research community, have harnessed advanced technology, cutting-edge research, and top-flight models to make the observations, to do the analyses, to turn those observations into rudimentary understanding, and then to put ourselves in a position of beginning to make predictions based on the objective analyses and observations that can then be used by the political process to decide what we as a species want to do in order to both capitalize on the opportunities and to meet the challenges of increased atmospheric CO2. And finally, we're not talking about things that have happened in the past. These observations, this research, and this modeling is continuing into the future so that we are actually, for the first time, able to see and to begin to understand how things are changing relative to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, not simply what the status is today.
Okay, our next question, Chris Mooney, Washington Post.
Hi, thank you. So as you know, decision makers are already making decisions based on their understanding of the carbon cycle. And in fact, there is a carbon budget that is what we think we can burn to not go over 2 degrees C. Based on all the uncertainties you highlighted, should we trust the current carbon budget, which is the center of all these negotiations?
Let's see. Anybody on the panelists interested in answering that question?
I'll I'll try it again.
Okay.
This is Scott Doney. I can take a shot.
Oh, okay. Great, Scott.
So there are a number of...
just so everybody's aware, Scott Doney is a colleague of Mike Behrenfeld. He's at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Go ahead, Scott.
So the question really comes down to how much more carbon can we put into the atmosphere to meet certain climate. If you were to put a threshold of this is how much climate change we want to have. And so the uncertainties are twofold. One is for a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere, how big is climate change going to be? And the other is for a certain amount of, how much carbon can we put in and really know that we'll have a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere. The problems that we've been alluding to today are that only about half of the carbon stays in the atmosphere that we emit. And the models we're trying to build and what a lot of the work that's gone into the satellite missions and these field missions eventually will improve those models of the future carbon cycle. And I'd say right now we have a sense for what the biggest uncertainties are, and probably the one that George highlighted, what's going to happen to the tundras, is something that's not in a lot of the models that are currently being used as the basis for policy discussions. There are also big uncertainties about parts of the ocean carbon cycle, and that's what's motivating a lot of the research that's going on now, either out in the Atlantic or up in the Arctic. Does that help?
Okay, anybody else want to respond to that? Otherwise, we'll go on to our next question.
This is Mike Freilich. I'll just add to Scott's excellent answer. The measurements that we are making now and the models that we are building now are indeed global. That's the unique vantage point that space affords for us. Actually, many of the land measurements that have historically been made have been made in areas which are not necessarily climatically critical, not real sensitive. Now we are making the measurements across the entire globe so that we can understand what is going on in climatically critical, not simply easy to measure places.
Okay, our next question is from Brian Kahn at Climate Central. Go ahead, Brian. All right, I think we're not.
Brian, you may want to check your mute button.
Oh, okay, he may be on
I'm sorry about that. I just realized Yep, I was on mute. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So this question is somewhat related to Chris's question. You guys have mentioned a lot about talking how this kind of work can move from science to helping policymakers. So I'm wondering if you can describe any specific ways that you envision, these different monitoring techniques and improved modeling. How exactly do you hope or envision helping policymakers specifically?
All right, George, would you like to take a crack at that one?
Sure, I'll do that. And I can comment maybe on add to the previous question too, which I thought was answered very well. I would start by saying that it's probably common that policymakers are challenged with making decisions with imperfect information. And given what we know about climate change, I think there's a strong case to make decisions based on that current knowledge. But at the same time, what we're showcasing here is dramatic efforts to improve that knowledge base, and I think that will lead to even better and more detailed decision-making in the future. In the carbon monitoring system, we have a specific charge of working to provide data products that support decision makers. And although we're a relatively new program, we already have some examples of note. One that I showed in my illustration was a very high resolution map of forest carbon over the state of Maryland. And in fact, the products we've generated out of this product are actually supporting state decision-making in Maryland regarding the management of the extent of forested land and also the state's effort to regulate or limit its carbon emissions. But this is just one of many examples. We have multiple projects as we are continuing to expand the carbon monitoring system.
Okay, thank you, George. Our next question is from Irene Klotz at Reuters.
The questions from my colleagues are interesting because I think what we're all trying to grapple with is, given your very excellent and detailed explanations of how complicated and variable the story of carbon on Earth is, what sort of impact will that have on, specifically, you've mentioned this UN conference in Paris coming up soon. What sort of information can be fed into something as imminent as that in trying to set policy and regulations that affect huge numbers of industries, people, everything? And then on a more specific note, it's also interesting that you said that these the take-up, reabsorption of carbon varies tremendously from 0 sometimes to 100% others. Is there anything that you've seen that you can point to as why some years all of the carbon is reabsorbed and why some years none is? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Anne-Marie, would you want to tackle that second part of that question?
Great. Hi, this is Anne-Marie. So this question of why each year is so different from another, I think at this point we can say that we've seen some connections, but we don't have quantitative proof that they are the explanation. And for example, in years that El Niños occur are often quite different from the years that they don't occur. But we now want to go and actually understand why is that? How much is that related to temperature changes? How much is it related to more rain in some regions? How much is it related to the ocean temperatures? So that's an example of some large phenomena that impacts a lot of regions around the globe and therefore must be impacting the carbon cycle, and now we want to put numbers to why that's happening. There are other ways that our weather and climate can be different from year to year. We can remember how sometimes the circulation around the pole is quite different, and wintertime can be colder than usual in some of regions of Europe and North America. Similar global patterns of the winds are likely to also impact the carbon cycle, and if we have now this denser data set, we can better connect what we observe to those larger atmospheric dynamic phenomena. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else want to tackle those questions? Okay, we'll go on to our next question. This is from Twitter, Christina Reed. What's the current best explanation for the methane stagnation during the early 21st century and the reason now for its rise? Anne-Marie, again, back to you on that.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Was that Leslie or Anne-Marie?
That's so.
Or is that more for you, Leslie?
I can try to speak to that. So that's a good question, and I think it's another one of those lingering mysteries that we really need some better observations to sort out. One of the theories is that there may be changes in the removal of methane, the chemical loss, which affects the lifetime. Another theory is that you could have changes in methane because of changes in tundras and the high latitudes, which is a theme you've heard from a couple people. And the other, I think, prevailing theory is that you might be seeing impacts of changes in wetlands, which are a major source of methane to the atmosphere, and how those are responding to climate influencing some of the trends. But there's no clear answer, and so that's a very active area of scientific research right now.
This is Scott Doney. I should just add there are concerns about human emissions of methane as well, and whether as we tap natural gas fields, there are problems with leakage, and so there are concerns about whether that's changed over time and could be affecting the growth rate of atmospheric methane.
Okay, thank you. Another question from social media. if the ocean is consuming much of the CO2 from the atmosphere, at some point it may become full, and then we would have a large accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, causing serious damage to the planet. If this is true, could we predict when it would occur? Or also, how would that affect ecosystems in the ocean? Mike Behrenfeld or Scott, would you want to answer that?
Yeah, this is Mike Behrenfeld again. So I think actually Scott would be the best position to answer that question. A lot of the carbon dioxide uptake by the oceans is a physical-chemical process. Certainly one of the big concerns from an ecological standpoint is that as CO2 builds up in the atmosphere and climate warms, that will have an impact on the plankton, and then that would create feedbacks through the biological carbon cycle. But Scott, would you like to maybe address that issue of the capacity of the oceans to take up CO2?
Sure. As Mike said, most of the current uptake into the ocean we think is because of dissolution, chemical dissolution into the water, and then physical processes that transport carbon away from the ocean surface into the deep interior. So two things will likely happen in the future. One is, as the ocean takes up more carbon dioxide, the water actually becomes more acidic, and it becomes less effective. It doesn't reach a threshold where it stops, but it's like a sponge that's already pretty damp. It can take up less additional water. So that's pretty well understood. With a warmer climate, you also change ocean circulation, and we think that will also make the ocean less effective over time. And as Mike said, there might be changes in the biology, and that could work in either direction. That could either make the ocean more effective or less effective. There's many different processes, but for the chemical and physical processes, we think we have a pretty good handle, at least on the size of the problem, that the ocean will continue to take up carbon dioxide, but less effectively with time, with rising atmospheric levels and climate change.
Okay, our next question back to the phone lines is Frank Mooring, Aviation Week.
Thank you for this presentation. I have kind of a two-part question, and I guess the first part is for Michael Freilich about how and the question is, how would some of the future projects that you're working on fill holes in this model these models that you're developing, if you could give an example or two. And the other part of this is, I'm sure as you're aware, and this is for anybody, I guess, that there are some investigations underway at the political level into the possibility that oil companies have influenced the study of climate change. And I just wonder if the future projects are adequately funded, and if you see some kind of pushback or resistance to funding this kind of research. Thank you.
Okay, Frank, unfortunately, Mike Freilich had to step away, but we have Ken Jux here, who is our program scientist in this area at NASA headquarters. He can talk to you about that.
Yeah, thanks. So we do have a number of future observations. The first thing I'll say is all of the observations that we're making right now will continue to make them from the spacecraft that they're on, as long as they continue to work effectively. As you heard earlier from a number of the presentations, we do have a lot of other observations coming in the future. So for understanding changes in biomass across the entire globe, we have the JEDI mission, which is coming up. We'll continue the Landsat series of observations, which are important for understanding the carbon cycle. And then we have the PACE mission for understanding changes in the ocean biology. And further, we are currently hopefully going to get up some future CO2 observing satellites. Follow on to OCO2 is currently one of our desired missions, and we're doing some pre-planning for a follow-on with a different type of technology for CO2. So those are the types of missions that we are looking to do, and they're all well supported by NASA right now. And those will, assuming no issues arise, we will do those in the near future.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Steve Baragona at Voice of America. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for doing the call. I guess I'm kind of putting a finer point on the question that's been coming up in terms of kind of specifics on where these data might be used in climate negotiations. We've got things like the INDCs. I mean, will you be able to kind of monitor whether countries are doing what they say they're doing? Will you be able to kind of put precise figures on things like, if there's some like a price on carbon, if you're able to quantify those numbers better? If you can, give us some things that we're hearing about the negotiations where these might be effective, that would be helpful.
Again, that sounds like another question that is up George's area.
Sure. Well, I'll take a crack at that. And maybe Anne-Marie can fill in as well. One of the most challenging areas to previous climate negotiations has been the land carbon flux. And that's because the land has proven to be incredibly complex and heterogeneous and difficult to access with a consistent methodology because it's distributed over different countries and et cetera. And so at the present, that's still currently probably the case. But what NASA is doing and what we showed some examples of is innovating new technologies that are going to allow us to observe carbon on land globally with unprecedented detail and spatial resolution so that hopefully this information base will provide the basis for the land carbon to be managed or addressed under policy and not just fossil fuel emissions.
This is Anne-Marie. Can I add a couple comments, George?
Yes.
No, I was just going to say that when we talk about OCO2 measurements being focused on measuring sources and sinks around the globe, we certainly will try to tell people about the total flux of carbon dioxide on country scale sizes of the world. Now remember that number is the net of what the land is doing, the ocean is doing, and fossil fuel CO2 emissions. So we don't separate out into those categories, but we see what they do as an integrated way. And certainly OCO2 has been an important step to demonstrate that you can measure OCO2 with the precision you need from space. We're a sampling mission where we only see a small fraction of the land each day, so we're not designed for the questions of compliance. One certainly could think about building something focused on that now that we've seen that we can make measurements from space. So I think we have some new capabilities, but not designed for that particular question.
So this is Ken Jux. I have one other thing I would like to add. As far as potential users of all of our data and the ideas that we get from these data, our data are free and open and available to everybody who wants to use them. And we do not constrain how people use these data. And many people come up with very creative ideas of how to use the data and come up with science questions that these data sets were never intended initially to answer, yet people do use those data and answer them to do very creative, both scientific and potential policy-related things. So there's quite a breadth of types of people who will end up using these data. And just to follow up on related to COP, most of what we presented to you today are really going to be relevant once we start getting better understanding of all of these science questions that we're trying to attack for future policy. In the near term, within a couple of weeks, is probably not going to have a huge impact, but it will have an impact for future potential policy-relevant meetings.
Okay, our next question was emailed in from David Schlom at North State Public Radio. What has OCO2 been able to measure regarding the rate of CO2 absorption in the Pacific this year, and whether there is a strong correlation with the strong El Nino happening there? Anne-Marie, and then maybe Mike Behrenfeld would like to tackle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, we have one researcher who's leading an effort to look at the Pacific and specifically find out if the carbon exchange is different this year. What I can say is he's noticed that before February and March, there appeared to be less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in that region than is typical for the previous, say, 5-6 years. And after that period, the carbon dioxide concentrations look to be a little bit larger. This analysis is a little bit tricky because you don't have a long record of detailed observations in the region, so it's hard to say if anything's changed. But based on what information we have, it does look like this year's a little different than the years before. And now what he's doing is working with folks like Leslie and others who can run models to try to understand a little bit more of what the influencing factors are. This work's a little bit tricky because you might remember there's big fires in Indonesia, and they themselves have an impact. And then the growth of the land trees in Amazon also can influence things. So there's a few factors we're looking at. And I don't know if Mike or George want to add more.
So this is Mike Behrenfeld. One of the things I could add to this is that if you look at the satellite record to date, which is going on 20 years in length now, unbroken, and we look at the estimated productivity of the ocean over that record, what we can see is that one of the largest anomalies within that record is associated with a large El Nino La Nina transition that occurred in 1999 to 2000. And what you see during an El Nino from an ecological perspective is that in certain regions of the ocean you actually see increases in production, and in other regions of the ocean you see decreases. When I was doing my 5-minute overview, I mentioned that we can see interannual or year-to-year changes in ocean production on the order of 2 billion tons of carbon. And that largest anomaly that we've seen was associated with the El Nino La Nina that I talked about in 1999 to 2000, with the La Nina being a high time of production and the El Nino being anomalously low ocean production.
Okay, thank you. Our next call from the phone lines is from Voice of America. I'm sorry, from Climate Wire. Gayatri Vaidyanathan, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks for taking my question. Could you tell me how useful the OCO2 satellite and also the future JEDI project will be at resolving uncertainties about the tropical carbon sink, especially given how cloudy the region is?
Hi, this is Anne-Marie. So, indeed, the tropics are cloudy, and that's a little bit frustrating because it's where a lot of the action is with the carbon cycle. One of the ways that we designed our mission was to have footprints that are on the scale of sort of, say, 1 kilometer by 1.5 kilometers in size. And the reason we did this was to try to make it so that we could see through regions that had patchy clouds. We do have successful retrievals in the tropical regions. We have some limitations over the Amazon at the moment, but we are improving some of the ways we process the data, so I think we'll have a higher data yield. So far, the carbon cycle scientists that we've spoken to who are interested in looking at that data do find that there's information to work with, although we'd like to feed them a little bit more. So I think in the long run, we will say something about the carbon exchange in the tropics because we did design this instrument with very small footprints.
This is George here. I would like to add to that. The tropics, as you point out, is a region of land that has particularly high uncertainty to date, and that's primarily because of the relatively limited access to many areas in the tropics, and as you point out, the cloud cover that hinders to some extent remote sensing of that area. But in that context, the JEDI mission, as I was describing, is going to, I think, provide qualitative advance in our information of that area because, for example, JEDI will be on the International Space Station. The International Space Station orbits the Earth about every 92 minutes. And so over the course of JEDI's mission, there will be literally billions of so-called footprints. These are these top-down LiDAR signals that image vegetation 3D structure. We'll have literally billions of those over the course of the JEDI mission, and many of those, but not all, will bypass cloud cover given the high orbit rate and the duration of the mission.
Okay, thank you. One more question from social media. Why does it appear that there's more CO2 in the northern hemisphere? Wouldn't that have been globally mixed by now, since it has such a long lifetime in the atmosphere? Leslie, could you address that?
Sure. It depends on the time scale you're looking at, is the short answer. You do see it particularly during the Northern Hemisphere winter, when the net flux of CO2 is moving to the atmosphere. So you have both emissions from fossil fuel, and you also have plants releasing carbon during winter months. So during the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, you see high CO2 in the Northern Hemisphere, and you see that slowly get mixed throughout the globe, but that mixing is a little bit slow. That takes, on average, about a year for all of that carbon to sort of be mixed down to the Southern Hemisphere away from the source region. So you do see that happening, but you also see that signal of the local emissions.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. And that's all the time we have for the press briefing today. If you'd like to ask more questions, please, we'll send them to Twitter or Ask NASA or to our media office, and we'll get back to you. And just as a reminder, we do have a lot of information and the visuals online right now, so you can take a look at those at www.nasa.gov/carbonclimate, one word. Thank you all for listening. Have a great day.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.
Thanks again.